Colonization, the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. By 1914, Europe had colonized more than 80% of the world. Beginning around the 14th century, Europe's colonial project involved the brutal subjugation and repression of indigenous people, which continued well into the 20th century. Here are 6 of the worst colonial atrocities committed by European powers in the 1900s. More than 3 million people died of starvation during the Bengal Famine in 1943. Conditions were so bad that parents dumped their starving children into wells. Some starving people even took their lives by throwing themselves in front of trains. The famine wasn't caused by drought, but a failure of British policy. 1942 was a bad rice harvest season, but the situation was made worse by colonial policies. The British restricted interstate trade of rice and grain, and even as things got worse, they refused to declare the famine an actual famine. They implemented a policy to provide rice at a fixed price, but only for workers in factories who were involved in Britain's war effort. They also diverted critical food supplies to their soldiers and to Greece. Poor landless agricultural labourers ended up starving. This shortage was worsened by a restriction on rice imports from Burma, which was occupied by Japan at the time. At the time, Prime Minister Winston Churchill remarked, "I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." King Leopold II took over a large part of Central Africa in 1885. He promised to bring civilization and improve the lives of Africans. But instead, he enslaved the local population to extract the Congo's resources: rubber, ivory, and minerals. If a village didn't meet his production quota, there would be retribution: the chopping of limbs. Orphan kids were also kidnapped and transported to child colonies to train soldiers. Many died because of the poor conditions. No one will ever know how many Congolese died, but some historians say that between the famine, disease, and killings, the number could be around 10 million. The profits of this exploitation was poured back into Belgium. King Leopold II even started a human zoo in Belgium, which featured 267 Congolese people as exhibits. Germany established a colony in southwest Africa, or what is now known as Namibia, in 1880. It was home to groups of native pastoralists like the Herero and the Nama. Their land and animals were often confiscated for German settlers. Many of the tribesmen were enslaved, and women and girls were regularly raped. In 1904, when the Herero and the Nama heard the Germans were planning to herd their winter reserves, they launched an attack that killed 125 Germans. In response, the Germans sent 14,000 soldiers who defeated a small group of Herero men. After the battle, any women, children, or men the Germans found were killed. Some survivors were pushed into the desert and died of thirst because the Germans had poisoned the wells. After this, many of them were forced into camps. 65,000 to 80,000 Hereros died, and 10,000 Namas, which was more than 80% of the Herero population and 50% of the Nama. Algeria was under French control starting in 1830. In 1945, after the Germans surrendered in World War II, Algerians celebrating and calling for autonomy were met with violence. In the town of Sétif, French forces opened fire on crowds. The Algerian state says 45,000 people were killed. Anti-colonial resistance eventually led to the Algerian War of Independence. French forces raided towns and villages through bombing, arrests, and torture, including burning, water torture, and electrocutions. A French general said, "Very rarely were prisoners questioned at night and alive in the morning." An estimated 1.5 million Algerians were killed during the war. Early in the 20th century, British settlers began kicking the native Kikuyu tribes in Kenya off their land so that they could establish tea and coffee plantations. By the 1920s, Kikuyu were restricted to reserves. 3,000 white settlers owned more land than 1 million Kikuyu. After years of marginalization, disaffected Kikuyus formed a secret resistance called the Mamaw Uprising. By 1952, the Mamaw started carrying out attacks on white-owned plantations. The British declared a state of emergency and waged a brutal campaign that lasted till 1960. The British military terrorized villages by rounding up suspected insurgents and civilians. Collective punishment was enforced. The Kenyan Human Rights Commission estimates that the British maimed, killed, or tortured 90,000 Kenyans. Another 160,000 were detained in camps, where torture, rape, and castration were routine.
During World War I, Indians helped the British war effort with men and resources.
Despite this, Britain enforced repressive emergency measures. When the war ended, Indians expected the measures to be lifted and India to be granted autonomy. Neither happened, so protests erupted throughout India, particularly in the Punjab province. A ban was placed on public gatherings. On April 13, 1919, 10,000 unarmed men, women, and children gathered in Jallianwala Bagh. While some had gathered to protest, others were passing through to celebrate Baisakhi, a religious festival at a temple nearby. British troops turned up unannounced, blocked the exit to the square, and started firing without warning. The men carried on firing for 10 minutes until their ammunition ran out. Official figures state that 379 people died, with over 1,000 injured. Brigadier Dyer, the man in charge of the massacre, explained that his goal was not to disperse protesters, but to punish Indians for their disobedience.